Let's be real. You were her break in case of emergency guy, the one she knew would always pick up the phone. You were the constant stream of validation she needed to go out and entertain other, more exciting options. But now that you've taken yourself off the menu, now that you've finally walked away, her whole world is in a panic. Suddenly, your phone is blowing up with "I miss you" texts and "I made a huge mistake" voicemails. But before you even think about hitting reply, before you let that familiar wave of false hope wash over you, you need to hear this. You need to understand the brutal, cold, and empowering truth. She doesn't miss you. She misses the safety net. She didn't lose the love of her life. She lost her options. And the panic you're seeing has nothing to do with love and everything to do with the sudden, terrifying shrinkage of her world. There's a saying that nails this perfectly. She didn't cry when she had you. She cried when she realized you weren't coming back. That sentence is the key to everything. It shows the difference between taking a resource for granted and feeling the sharp pain of it being gone for good. And today we're going to unpack that panic. We're going to break down exactly what's happening in her mind, so you can finally see her regret for what it is, a desperate reaction to losing a resource, not a genuine rediscovery of your worth. 1. The back pocket reality. The anatomy of being the backup plan. To get why she's panicking now, you have to fully accept the role you were playing. You weren't the leading man in her movie. You were the reliable supporting actor, the emotional anchor, the one-man support system that gave her the stability to go audition other guys. Think about it. Your consistency was the platform she used to leap into uncertainty with other men. Your validation was the cash she spent to feel valuable when some thrilling new prospect left her feeling insecure. She wasn't in love with you, the man with ambitions, flaws, and dreams. She was in love with the security you gave her. You were the fixed point in her chaotic dating life, the guaranteed comfort when a new flame burnt out. When she was bored, you were entertainment. When she was lonely, you were company. When another guy disappointed her, you were the shoulder to cry on, reassuring her of her worth, and without realizing it, making her strong enough to go try again with someone else. This is a critical distinction to make. People who are truly in love with you don't use your heart as a charging station for their ego. They don't treat your affection like a snack to be eaten only when their main course isn't available. You are her safety net. And the thing about a safety net is you don't appreciate it when you're standing on solid ground. You only notice it when you start to fall. She had the ultimate freedom, the freedom to explore, chase excitement, and see what's out there, all while knowing that if it all went wrong, you'd be there to catch her. Your reliable presence lowered her risk. It removed the consequences from her choices, and in a cruel twist of human psychology, that very reliability, the quality that makes a man a great long-term partner, is what made you seem less valuable in her eyes. You were a sure thing, and therefore you were boring. You were the safe bet, not the winning lottery ticket. But after a long enough losing streak, every gambler starts to miss the money they started with, and that's where her panic begins. 2. The revelation when the world shrinks. So what happens when the safety net is suddenly yanked away? What happens when the break in case of emergency glass is shattered, but the box is empty? Simple. Her world, which once seemed like an endless buffet of options, shrinks. Fast. The panic that kicks in is a direct result of this sudden claustrophobic new reality. It's not a romantic epiphany, it's a strategic crisis. Her panic is really built on 4 collapsing pillars. First, and most importantly, she lost her primary option. The psychological comfort of knowing you were always there was the most valuable and most overlooked asset she had. It's a known phenomenon that the perceived value of something skyrockets the moment it becomes unavailable. While you were there, you were just one of many possibilities, but your confident silence sends a powerful message. It says that you respect yourself more than you crave her. This triggers a powerful psychological response known as loss aversion. The pain of losing something feels way stronger than the pleasure of gaining something equal. She didn't just lose an option, she lost the most reliable one, the one she had mentally bookmarked as her forever fallback. That isn't heartbreak, it's the cold shock of a door slamming shut. Second, the validation supply has been cut off. For weeks, months, maybe even years, you were her main source of validation. Your attention, your compliments, your willingness to listen, it was all a constant drip feed for her self-esteem. When you walked away, you didn't just take your love, you took the mirror where she saw her most flattering reflection. The silence you leave is deafening, because it's filled with the absence of your praise. This sudden withdrawal causes a massive drop in self-esteem, forcing her to face insecurities she had been successfully outsourcing to you. Her desperate pleas to get you back aren't an attempt to fix the relationship, but a frantic effort to turn the validation faucet back on. Third, the terror of true loneliness sets in. There's a huge difference between being single with a reliable backup and being truly, completely alone. As long as you were in her back pocket, she never had to face the void. The fear of loneliness is one of the most powerful human emotions, often causing people to stay in toxic relationships just to avoid it. When she first left, she probably felt relief, even freedom, but as that initial high wears off, a deeper, scarier loneliness starts to creep in. This is her entering the bargaining stage of grief. Her panic texts are a symptom of this delayed reaction. She's not reaching out because she's done the deep work to realize your value. She's reaching out because the reality of her solitude is unbearable, and she's grabbing for the quickest, most familiar antidote, you. Fourth, the social status drop. In many circles, being in a committed relationship carries social weight. It signals desirability, stability, and maturity. When she let you go, she may not have thought about the social fallout. She lost her +1, her shared calendar, and the status that came with having a devoted partner. This loss can trigger a kind of reputational anxiety. Her identity as part of a couple is gone, and now she's just single, which can feel like a demotion in her social world. Her outreach can be a desperate attempt to repair her public image, especially if mutual friends are involved who highlight the breakup's social impact. It's less about missing you and more about missing how being with you made her look to everyone else. 3. The solution: indifferent self-improvement and the power of silence. So now you see the storm raging in her mind. You see her "I miss you" texts, not as a confession of love, but as a distress signal from a ship that's lost its anchor. The question is, what do you do? The urge to respond, to accept the apology, to finally get the validation you wanted for so long is massive. But the biggest mistake you can make right now is to answer her call. Your power isn't in your words, it's in your silence. The no contact rule isn't a trick to make her miss you. It's a tool for you to heal and for her to face the consequences. Your silence is deafeningly loud to her, and here's why. First, it skyrockets your value. When you were always around, your value was ironically lower, but your withdrawal creates scarcity. It signals that your time, energy, and attention are precious resources that are no longer free. This confident move kills any perception of neediness and dramatically boosts your perceived value. It forces her to rethink her entire assessment of you. The man she thought was a boring certainty is now an intriguing uncertainty she can't figure out. Second, it forces her to sit with her choices. As long as you're there to soothe her anxiety, she never has to fully deal with her decision. Your replies act as a temporary fix for her loneliness and regret. By staying silent, you remove that emotional crutch. You make her live in the world she created, a world without her safety net. This isn't about punishment. It's about letting reality be her teacher. The discomfort she feels is a necessary step for her to ever have a genuine insight, instead of just a knee-jerk reaction. Third, and most importantly, it gives you the space to actually move on. This time isn't for waiting around. It's for building a life where her return doesn't even matter. While she's panicking about her lost options, you should be focused on becoming a man of more options yourself. This is the time for indifferent self-improvement. Throw yourself into your purpose. Double down on your career, your business, your mission. Get in the best shape of your life. Reconnect with friends and build a fun new social circle. Learn that skill, take that trip, read those books. Every bit of energy you used to spend wondering about her should now be plowed back into yourself. The goal isn't to show her what she lost. The goal is to build a life so awesome that you genuinely don't care if she sees it or not. Her panic is her problem. Your future is your masterpiece. And the funny thing is, this real detachment, this focus on your own growth, is the most attractive thing you can possibly do. By the time she might have a real epiphany, you'll have built a new reality for yourself. One where you're the prize. You'll have leveled up so much that going back to the old dynamic would feel like a major step down. If you've ever been here, if this story is hitting home right now, hit that subscribe button. This channel is a community for men who are done being the backup plan and are ready to be the main event in their own lives. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever seen an ex panic after you finally walked away? Sharing your story helps other guys see they aren't alone. 4. Decoding her "I miss you." Panic versus true remorse. Eventually your silence might become too much for her, and the panic text will escalate. They'll get more emotional, more desperate. She might bring up old memories, tell you everything you ever wanted to hear, and swear she's changed. In this moment, you have to become a detective of intent. You have to learn the difference between the language of panic and the actions of genuine remorse. Panic-driven regret is reactive. It's triggered by a negative feeling, loneliness, jealousy, or the fear of you moving on. It's full of intense emotional language that focuses on her feelings. "I'm so lonely. I made a mistake. I can't live without you," and it feels urgent. It's a desperate scramble to undo a decision that led to immediate, unpleasant consequences for her. Her goal is to stop her own pain. Genuine remorse, on the other hand, is proactive and thoughtful. It comes from real introspection and empathy. It focuses not on her pain, but on the pain she caused you. The language is different. It sounds less like "I miss what you did for me," and more like "I understand how my actions hurt you, and I am truly sorry for that." Genuine remorse isn't in a rush. It understands that trust isn't rebuilt with one text, but through consistent changed behavior over time. It respects your space and your silence, even if it hurts her. Look for the evidence. Is she just saying words she thinks you want to hear, or is she showing through her actions that she's actually changed? Has she spent time alone to understand why she acted that way, or is she just trying to swing from one branch back to you? A person who truly gets your worth won't try to pressure or manipulate you with emotional outbursts. They'll show their change through patience, consistency, and a clear-eyed view of their own flaws. They will want what's best for you, even if that isn't them. In most cases, what you're seeing isn't this deep, reflective remorse. It's a withdrawal symptom. The brain experiences the end of a validating relationship in a way that's a lot like drug withdrawal. The intense cravings, the obsessive thoughts, the panic. It's her system reacting to its drug being taken away. Giving in is like giving a fix to an addict. It might stop the noise for a moment, but it doesn't solve the real problem and just keeps the cycle going. Remember, her panic is a sign that she's feeling the consequences, not a sign that she's ready for a healthy relationship. 5. The danger of the false reconciliation. Let's play out the scenario you're tempted by. You've decoded her panic texts, but a weak voice inside you whispers, maybe she's really learned her lesson this time. You give in. You reply. You agree to meet. This is the moment you step into the trap of the false reconciliation, and it's a mistake that will cost you far more than the initial breakup. The first few weeks will feel like a dream. This is the honeymoon phase 2. She will be on her absolute best behavior, showering you with the affection and appreciation you always craved. Why? Because her fear of loss is at an all-time high. She's not acting out of a newfound love for you. She's performing the role of the perfect partner to re-secure her safety net. She is terrified of the loneliness and the shrunken world she just experienced, and she will do anything to make that feeling go away. You will mistake her relief for your love, but what happens when that fear subsides? Once she feels secure again, once you've proven through your actions that you're not going anywhere, the old dynamic will inevitably return. Complacency will creep back in. The respect she's performing, which was born from the terror of your absence, will fade, because it was never genuine respect in the first place. You'll stop being the prize she fought to win back and revert to being the reliable utility she takes for granted. The charging station for her ego is reinstalled, and the main course will once again be sought elsewhere, even if only emotionally at first. This time, however, a new poison enters the dynamic: resentment. She will resent you for being the safe choice she settled for, a constant reminder of her failed adventures. And you will resent her, and more importantly, yourself. Every time she's a little distant, every time she chooses her friends over you, you will be consumed by the memory of her betrayal. You will live in a state of low-grade anxiety, walking on eggshells, waiting for the other shoe to drop. You will have consciously accepted a demotion in your own life, taking back a person who demonstrated you are not her priority. The second breakup, and there will almost certainly be a second one, is 100 times more devastating. This time, she will leave with a clear conscience, telling herself and others, well, I gave it another try, and it just didn't work. The fault will, in her mind, be neutralized, but you will be left completely broken. You won't just be heartbroken, your self-respect will be shattered, because you had all the information, you saw the pattern, and you chose to walk back into the fire. You will have taught her that she can treat you poorly, leave and still be welcomed back. You will have validated her actions. A foundation built on panic cannot support a healthy future. It can only support a cycle of disrespect. Conclusion: the new reality. Let's wrap this up. The story she's trying to sell you now, that she's had a life-changing epiphany and you're the one for her, is a story designed to calm her own anxiety. It's a fiction born from the terror of lost options. The real story, the one you need to hold on to, is this: you were the safe harbor that let her sail recklessly. You were the foundation she stood on while admiring other flashier buildings. Now that you've walked away, the whole structure of her emotional world is shaking, and she is panicking. Her panic is not your problem to solve. It is not your cue to rush back in and play the hero. It is the natural, predictable result of her own choices. Let her miss the convenience of you. Let her regret losing her safety net. Let her sit in the silence. Your job is to turn your back on that noise and face your own future. That future is a blank canvas, and you are the artist. Every day you choose your purpose over her drama, your workout over her texts. your goals over her crisis. You add another powerful stroke to your masterpiece. The ultimate goal isn't to make her regret losing you. The ultimate goal is to build a life so incredible that you barely remember you lost her. By the time she truly understands what she threw away, you won't be the man she left. You'll be a man so far ahead, so focused on your own path, that you won't even glance back. Her panic is her storm to weather. Your future is the clear sky you're building for yourself. A sky you'll share with a woman who sees your value from the start, not just when her other options run out. You didn't lose, she did. Now go build the life that proves it.